Awesome. Hello, Lisa. Thank you so much for joining. I know we've been chatting back and forth for a while with just the chaos that is life. So I'm so excited that we actually were able to find a day that works. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, and thank you so much. I'm so happy to finally be here after all of that. My name is Lisa Weiss. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So I'm a licensed mental health professional. I specialize in equestrian related issues. I get to practice psychotherapy as well as I hold lectures, which is a really awesome part of my job that I enjoy so much. And outside of like the equestrian related trauma anxiety piece of things, I also just specialize in trauma in general. So I will see people who are not horse people for a variety of issues, and I also enjoy that work.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
It's so fun. Like I've found such a cool niche of people on social media that have targeted like equestrians in particular. And I love that because I do feel like we are such a special breed of people. But there's very individual things that come up that if you aren't a horse person, you might not be able to relate or understand on a full level. So I love that you've kind of put those two together. Did you know going into your line of work that that was something you wanted to do, like find equestrian niche in particular?
Not at all.
Cool.
So I've always loved horses, and I've been a horse person for quite some time. I went into grad school thinking I was going to work with veterans and PTSD, and like that was my thing. And then I very quickly shifted gears, and I ended up working with childhood trauma. And like right after graduate school, that was my main focus was doing trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy with survivors of child sexual abuse. And so it was it's still a population I work with, that's kind of also where my heart is.
Mhm.
Um, but I got into the equestrian work in an interesting way. I decided to do something called EMDR training, so eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It's a big trauma modality. And when I was in that training, it was experiential. So we had to partner up and work on a trauma memory. And I was sitting there thinking of like, what am I going to do? And my most recent like trauma memory was a fall I had with my horse. And so I'm like, okay, let's see where this goes. I didn't know what to expect. I was never a recipient of EMDR. And I thought it was really incredible with just the way that it worked and the different phases of that form of therapy and the relief that came from that. I so after that training, I was like, oh my goodness, like this is something that I can do with equestrian clients or just equestrians, and that's where that kind of started out, and then it's just blossomed from there, and it's been so incredible. I love working with horse people. And as you said, kind of we're our own breed.
Yes.
It's such a unique niche and it's really where my heart is.
Cool. And do you want to just explain for people who might not know what EMDR is?
Yes. So it's eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It's using bilateral stimulation. So it's for individuals who feel very stuck. So what we're doing is we're moving those trauma memories, or they don't even have to be trauma memories. This could be anxiety, grief, those sorts of things, from the emotional side of the brain to the logical side of the brain. So that way we're never able to erase these memories, but it's just desensitization of those. So maybe you were feeling like something was like a 10 out of 10 with how distressing that memory is. In EMDR, we really do try to get that down to like a 1 out of 10 or zero, ideally a 0 out of 10. Um, so it's no longer such a distressing thing. And when triggers do come up, we don't have that same sort of reaction. And again, we work in phases. So it's a lot of like history gathering, resourcing, making sure people are feeling ready to do that trauma work before we move into that reprocessing of the memory and desensitization of the memory, as well as helping people feel ready to go for future related things. So, like, what if this were to happen to you in the future? What sorts of tools do you think you're going to need to move through that?
So cool. I love it. Random question. Have you tried doing EMDR on a horse? Because my sister's also a therapist and has been
Okay.
to the barn and like played with some stuff. Like I have a very anxious dog, and my late gelding was a very anxious horse too, and she started to play around with some of that on him. It was really, really cool.
Yeah. So not in like a professional sort of sense, but there have been times where I like sit on my horse and I like on each side of the withers, I'm like tapping back and forth slow bilaterals. So I don't know if it's like actually more for him than it is for me to be like, we're fine, we're doing okay here. But yeah, I do think it could be so helpful for animals too. It's just I don't not professionally
And
equipped to.
I should disclaim, she doesn't do it professionally either. She was more just like, can I play with something? I was like, yeah, go for it. And it was so funny. And like I have two dogs, but my one very anxious dog, like she now, like, she doesn't like thunderstorms. And like, same thing. We just kind of like on her shoulders, do little pats.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my gosh, this is actually working. It's so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
it's just so interesting, like what that bilateral stimulation does for people and for animals.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's so fun. Um,
Yes. Yes.
so when I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to chat with you, I wanted to keep it like fairly open because I know you are very passionate, especially talking about like anxiety and grief when it comes to equestrians, because those just seem to be very predominant in our in our line of work. So I wanted to go through some of the like four major things that I see come up. So I work with clients more from like an equestrian biomechanics standpoint. So I go in and see like what muscles fire well, what muscles could work more optimally. And then 9 out of 10 times I end up working on anxiety. So
Wow, that's so interesting.
it's so interesting, and like little like habits that people have picked up that they don't realize that they're doing, and they're like, oh, my horse is going to do this, so like I'm ready for it. So I'm nowhere near like a therapist or anything like that, but I've done some somatic courses, and it's been so cool, like just seeing little, and again, like kind of like that bilateral, like breathing in, acknowledging your left sit bone, exhale, find your right, and just going back and forth. And like that's been super fun for me to incorporate. But from your world, chatting about anxiety with equestrians, what are some of the common things that you see coming up with that?
Yes, great question. And before I jump into that, just the different things that I'm saying are going to be for educational purposes only, not like if you feel like some of this stuff resonates with you, I highly recommend, and this is for the listeners, to reach out to like your primary care doctor or your therapist, a mental health professional.
Yes.
But yeah, so I think when it comes to anxiety, we are riding these like 1,200 pound, and not even just riding, we're present with these 1,200 pound animals, flight animals. And so a lot can happen. And I think a big piece of it too is especially as we're building relationships with horses, a lot of trust goes into that. So if they spook or something happens, it's like that trust is not necessarily broken, but it's like, oh goodness, like I didn't think this was something that could happen to me, and that can either replay, disrupt relationship, those sorts of things. So whether it's in in riding, or I think just like doing things with our horses on the ground too can be anxiety inducing based on previous experiences.
Absolutely. It's so interesting. Like, so I grew up riding, like I started riding when I was like 2.
Oh my
And
goodness.
I know, it's so fun. So like I had no fear. Like I was riding a draft horse in field and halter with no tack and like no fear. And I remember the exact ride. I was 23, and all of a sudden it was the first time on a horse that I had the thought of I could fall, like really fall. And it was like so like I had never ever had that thought before. Like I had had falls obviously, but it was the first time like nothing even really happened. But it was all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, like why am I doing this to myself?
Yeah.
And it was such an interesting sensation to kind of work through, um,
Mhm.
and to experience something that had been like my safe place for such a long time, which is I always find it so funny when equestrians say that, because again, like we're riding a massive prey animal that has its own swirly brain, and we're like, oh yeah, this is my happy place. But
Yeah.
it's so interesting. And like I would now I vary, but I wouldn't necessarily categorize myself as an anxious rider, but I'm a very much a cautious rider. And it's so fun for me to then work with people if there's still this culture in like the equestrian world of like around anxiety, and like people find it still quite like shameful, and like they don't fully understand it and don't feel like they should be anxious or whatever. And I find great pleasure in being like, I understand.
Yes, yeah. And especially coming from like a lifelong horse person and like a professional, it's like it can be so validating for students to hear. Like, hey, like, no, I totally understand and like I can relate to this. And I also think it's so interesting too, like you mentioned the age of like 23, and I like that's the when that last part of our brain is fully developed, like our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for foreseeing consequences and decision making. And so that's when we start having these thoughts too of like, really, is this like something I should be doing right now? Like really thinking through, and then, teenage years, you get on and you do all these sorts of crazy things and don't give it a second thought.
Yeah, I know. I think of like what I used to do. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I lived. Like, but
Yeah.
no fear.
Yeah, and now it's like, oh wait, we have bills to pay. Like we
Yes.
can't get hurt.
I'm like, I need my body for work. And like, it's
Yes.
so different. Like all of a sudden having just that extra responsibility. But yeah, and I think like, for people, like I go into it trying to set myself up for the best success that I can. I have proper fitting tack. I wear my helmet. Like I have chosen horses that are going to set me up for success. And it's so interesting talking to other clients going in where like they go in and they think there's this really pretty horse that they are wanting to buy, but they're nervous to ride it. And I'm like, you don't need a horse that you're nervous to ride. There's
Absolutely.
so many options out there. But I think it just comes down to like figuring out what you need to make yourself feel comfortable in those situations and going from there. But it's
Yes. Yeah, and thinking about like how horses really do pick up on our own anxiety. So if you're nervous, they're gonna be like, wait, we should be nervous too.
that was like my previous gelding. I lost him in September, and I will talk about grief in a little bit too. But it was so interesting. Like we had such a almost like unhealthy codependency of like I didn't want to let him down, he didn't want to let me down. So then there was just like we were just a ball of anxiety. And now
Mhm.
with my new mare, she's a tank. Like she's just like unfazed, and it's so interesting. Where I'm like, since I've had her like in late September, I'm like I remember that this is supposed to be fun. And like
Mhm.
there's not
Yes.
that anxiety, there's not this like there's none of that. And it's so refreshing to be like, oh yeah, I do really genuinely like this.
Mhm. Absolutely. And like how calming is that to like your nervous system too, to be
Yes.
like, wow, like we're okay and like we're having a good time. Because you can't have a good time if you're like feeling on edge all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there like particular things? So I know like anxiety is like so individual and such like a broad spectrum topic, but are there certain things that if someone is feeling anxious going into a ride, going into a show, going into whatever, are there certain techniques that they can play with? I know it's a very broad spectrum, but are there certain techniques that you kind of have in your back pocket for people to help relieve some of that anxiety?
Absolutely. And I think before jumping into that, even like explaining why our brains and our bodies respond this way. So I feel like that can be helpful for clients to know. It's like, okay, it's not just me. This is like a physiological reaction that I'm having in my body. And so I mentioned the prefrontal cortex before, which again is the part of the brain that's responsible for foreseeing consequences and decision making. But then we also have our amygdala, which is that reptilian part of the brain. And that is our fight, flight, or freeze. And so when we're put in situations that might make us anxious, our amygdala almost like pulls the fire alarm and it releases a chemical that actually clouds or can cloud our prefrontal cortex. So really clouds our ability to like make smart choices or kind of figure out what we're going to do next. So that could be really helpful for clients to know too, because especially if they get into that zone of like fight, flight, or freeze, it's like, what do I do now? But being able to understand how the brain works can be so helpful because when people start to feel, okay, I can feel my heart pounding out of my chest, what do I need to do for myself? So, before that fire alarm is pulled, what are the things that we can do for ourselves? So I talk a lot about grounding and like bringing ourselves back into the here and now. And one of my favorite things to teach clients is balloon or belly breathing. Have you heard of that before?
I'm the queen of diaphragmatic breathing. So
Okay.
that's like usually like, especially for like a question by mechanic sessions, I'm like, if you forget everything else we've talked about, breathe.
Yes. Yeah. And it's so helpful too because it really brings us back into the present moment. It's like it's really slowing down our central nervous system. So for those who have never heard of belly breathing before, it's one hand on your chest, one hand on your stomach, and then you take a deep breath in and imagine there's like a balloon in your stomach. So blowing up that balloon maybe for like 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds, and exhaling for 5 or 6. And do that a few times until you feel calm. And I always tell clients too, like if you start to feel dizzy, stop doing it. Like not something that you need to like push yourself to do. Um, so yeah, that and then the five senses technique, which I know is a very common one. So five different things you can see, four different things you can feel, three different things you can hear, two different things that you can smell, and then one thing you can taste. And it doesn't have to be in that order, but sometimes just like paying attention to the surroundings brings you out of that, uh-oh, what's going to happen to me, to let's focus on what's going on right now.
For me, that one was a game changer, specifically like while in the saddle, because I'm like, okay, we're breathing, we're good, we're good. But my
Yes.
brain would still be like, we have some triggers. So for me, just being like, what can I feel? What can I hear? And like, I would, some days I would have to go through that 2 or 3 times. But
Yeah.
that, like for me, anyways, that was so like, okay, I'm back, I'm here. And for me, like the just breathe. Everyone's like, oh, you're anxious, just breathe. I'm like, I'm breathing. It's not helping.
Yes, yeah. It's like, and then you're taking those like super shallow breaths.
Little breaths.
It's not getting you where you need to be. And even like with that too, it like calling things out loud to be like, I see a tree, I see poles. Like just to say things out loud can also be so helpful. And who cares who hears you?
Oh my God, if I was super anxious, I used to sing. Like
Yes.
I'd have like my phone in my pocket and I'd be like singing through it and like my gelding would just be like, oh, here she goes again. Like
Yes.
poor troubled little woman up there.
I can absolutely relate to that one. But that's another thing that could be so helpful too, is just like singing. It forces us to breathe and it gets our mind on, it's almost like a distraction, gets our mind on something else.
Yes. Yeah. But I think one thing that I talk about a lot with people is like for me, finally just acknowledging that I'm either like I'm an anxious rider, I'm a cautious rider, like just being able to like own that for me was a huge thing too, instead of like being embarrassed or like worrying about what people would think about that. And it was really refreshing. If I would go out with a hack with a new person, I would just say, I'm a nervous hacker. Hi.
Yeah.
And just I think like there's a lot more openness now in the horse world where like there's less judgment, or even if there is, then like at least they just understand of like I need a second or whatever, and they can be a little bit more willing to work with you instead of going off at a gallop. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not doing that, thank you.
Absolutely. No, and that's spot on. And I mean, to be honest with you, I do the very same thing. And I like set the standard as soon as
Yes.
I leave the farm. I'm like, look, this is what I'm comfortable with. This is what I'm not comfortable with.
Yes.
And I feel like, 99.9% of the time people are like, yep, I'm totally fine with just walk trot today.
Yes. And if
Um,
they're not, I don't want to be riding with them because they won't have my back if I need it. So it's
mhm.
been, yeah, I've had nothing but lovely experiences with that so far, luckily. But I know that's hard for people. It's unnerving to like say that out loud. And like there's like it's not as commonly accepted, I think, yet. It's getting there in the horse world, but I think what people forget is this is supposed to be fun. And if you are super scared and fearing for your safety, that's not fun.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think like a big part of how you were talking about like the change in the equestrian world is I think we're just actually having vulnerable conversations about
Yes.
things now. And so like I so appreciate this podcast too, where it's like opening up the conversation to be like, if you feel this way, it's okay. This is
Yeah.
nothing to be ashamed about, and that you're not alone in this.
And there's no right way to be a horse person. Like you can make your own little, like, I don't show, I have no desire to show, I have no desire to trailer my horse and do really extravagant hacks because that terrifies me. And so like I've found my own little horse world of like, this is super fun and I'm very happy and there's no pressure and little triggers compared to putting myself into a situation where I'm completely unraveling.
Absolutely. Yep. And then when you're able to like really own that, then you find other people that like align with you
Yeah,
on that.
and
It's
then
really
it's so
cool.
fun, and you have these lovely horse people that like hype you up when you're like
Yes,
out on, even though it was windy, and they're like,
absolutely. Yes, yeah. I used to have a friend at the barn and like we'd be like, okay, we're going down to the end of the road today, and then we can turn around once we get there. And it's like, we're gonna do this together.
and I love that. Then it's fun, and yes, yeah.
Absolutely. Hmm.
Okay, the next one that I wanted to chat about is grief. And I feel like that's such a huge umbrella term because I've dealt with lots of clients and myself where like it's not necessarily just the loss of your equine partner, but like the change in expectation of what you might be doing with that horse, talking about retirement and like closing the chapter of that show experience with that particular horse. So I know like grief can be a huge umbrella term, but I've seen lot like I love all of your posts on grief and like talking about how it's just such a I like I said, I lost my gelding in September, and I'm so fortunate that everyone in my life understood what he meant to me. And but I feel like if you're in more of like a corporate job or like an office job, like they might not understand that you just lost your heart and soul. And it can
Absolutely.
be almost more detrimental than losing a human because it's
Yes.
such a different relationship. And yeah,
Yeah, and can absolutely be so complicated for people outside of the horse world to understand. And I think it can be helpful to put like terms to things. And so when we think about like grief in the equestrian world, oftentimes it's that disenfranchised grief. So
mm-hmm.
that's a form of grief that's not like socially recognized.
Yes.
So it can be incredibly hard when other people do not understand, and as well as like the as you had mentioned, the different forms of grief. So the ambiguous grief, which is grieving the loss of someone or something that is still alive. So maybe you were leasing a horse and that horse was sold, and so that's no longer your horse. And as you mentioned, like retirement and things like that, it's all it's all grief. And experiencing something like that can also have other sorts of grief come bubbling back up to the surface. So it could be a really complicated time for equestrians.
Do you have like any specific tools or like things? I know like from like I prepped for his death. Like I like, talked to
Mhm.
my therapist for like 2 months before we came to the conclusion that it was time. And like for me, that was super helpful. But I know that's not unfortunately accessible for everyone. So are there certain things that you have found that help people prepare for that or move on it? I hate that terming, but I can't figure out a different way to word that of like come to peace with it. There, I found a better term.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're able to prepare for those sorts of things, and like even have other like equestrian professionals like your trainer and or barn manager, people like that that can be present with you for those sorts of things can be so helpful, as well as surrounding yourself with like-minded people who understand what you're going through. So I love the fact that you were able to chat about that with your therapist beforehand, especially just mentally preparing yourself for something like that. And in like following the loss of a horse, whether that's like because a horse has passed away or retirement, things like that, allowing yourself to grieve. I think and there's no timeline, and I know that sounds so cheesy, but I like to compare grief to like waves. So it's like one day you could be feeling totally fine, and the next day it could hit you just as hard as the day of losing them. Um, and I think that can absolutely feel very confusing to people.
It's like I was like so prepared. Like I'm type A personality, so like yes, I prepared for these things, but it was like for me, like we had a really tough summer. His health was not good. I was exhausted, completely burnt out. It was his time, so like I found a lot of peace with that. But I know not as many people are lucky to like have the time to like prepare for that. But it's so fascinating. Like I had so many messages from people like the day he passed, but for me, it was the next day that was even harder because the day he passed, I had a job. I understood like this is how this day is going to go. And then the next day I woke up, I'm like, and now he's just not here. And
Yes.
it was so
Mhm.
it like I was very fortunate. Like I had friends who knew that that day would likely be harder for me and like they checked in. But I
Mhm.
think it's like you said, there's no timeline. And I feel like people immediately are like, oh, I'm so sorry. okay, that's done.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
yeah, or like, oh, now you have a new horse, so now like now you're over like losing him, and it's so not the case. And I think I was very fortunate like to come to peace with that, but I know several people like it's so hard moving on to their next partnership with a new horse of like you aren't the same.
Yes.
It's hard to kind of move over that hump and be at peace with your new partner and all the
Mhm.
quirks that they might bring.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of holding that truth where it's like, yes, I still very much miss this other horse, but like I'm focused on like building and enjoying my relationship with my new horse, which can be hard to like hold those two things because it can feel so conflicting. And I think just really if you're feeling like a certain type of way, like not trying to shove those feelings down, it's really important to talk about these sorts of things with, again, like-minded people.
Yes.
And not people who are going to be dismissive of like, just like move on, like they were just a horse and blah, 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 like not really fully understanding that relationship and that sense of purpose and all those sorts of things that come with like having a partnership with a horse.
Yeah. I think that's where it's just such a different relationship of like just what horses allow us to do, like the fact that you sit on them and you travel through space, and like the amount, like you mentioned, like the amount of trust that goes into that relationship. I have very lovely relationships with like humans in my life, but there is nothing like that.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Any other like general statements, thoughts when it comes to grief with horse world?
Yeah, and I think like we've all heard of like just like the like stages of grief and things like that, and I always talk about how like healing is not linear and grief is not linear. We
Mhm.
don't move from this thing to this thing to this thing to this thing and then we're done. It's like horses, how can I phrase this? It's we're allowed to feel how we feel. And we shouldn't be pressured one way or another to like move on and things like that. It's we're trying to find the right words, and this is maybe where we got to crop it out. Um, but yeah, just like honoring your feelings as well as like finding that community. And sometimes it could feel good to isolate, but I recommend not isolating for too long.
Mhm.
Just because like spending time with people too can also be so healing. People might feel like apprehensive about like going back out again, and especially hanging out with their horse friends, like that might be triggering. But it can also be very healing because these are the people that understand you the most when it comes to the horses.
And that's like it wasn't long after he passed that I was still like very much involved with my barn. I knew like I would be getting a new horse at some point and would be going back to that barn because that is my family. And
Mhm.
but it wasn't very long. Like I went to go clean up my locker and stuff, and like I happened to go at dinner time, and like I helped bring all the horses in. And my friend was like, "Are you okay with this?" I'm like, "This is actually really nice. Like this is familiar. This feels good. Like no, it's not the same." And like yes, I'm sad his paddock is empty, but it's
Mhm.
still like I still found so much comfort in all the other horses in our barn because we're fairly tight, we're fairly tight group.
And that's so wonderful too to like have that community of people and just to like have that space. Like what a unique experience to just be able to like go back and still participate.
Yes.
Um,
Well, just
yeah.
like the amount of people that offered, they're like, no pressure, but if you want to come ride my horse, you can. And like at that point, I was like, it's not going to be mine. I'm not ready for that. But
Yes.
I did like I think it was the night before I went to go like try. It was the first horse I went to go try. I ended up, she was perfect. So that's who I got. But I did hop on my friend's horse like before because I'm like, I need to sit on a horse that I know that isn't mine before I go and try a brand new horse that I don't know. And
Mhm.
it was so nice just to have all of the options available to figure out what I needed to be ready for that process. So I think like anytime I had another friend ask to like her friend was putting her horse down, she's like, anything I can do for her? I'm like, don't stop checking in. Like,
Yes.
even though it's been a week or whatever, it's like don't stop checking in, don't stop offering like access to horses or whatever it may be, because she might at some point all of a sudden say yes.
Yes, absolutely. And I think even kind of going off of that too is like some people check in for like the first week or so, and then it's like then those check-ins stop.
Yeah.
And that can also feel isolating when like those are the moments where people need that support too and might be apprehensive about reaching out. They don't want to be bothersome, X, Y, and Z. But also like thinking about anniversaries of death and how those can also feel so heavy. So making just being like keeping those sorts of things in mind for friends and loved ones when it comes to grief and loss.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so this may be more for me, but I'm sure other people experience it too. I put like horse mom guilt.
Mhm.
And I'm better with my mare than I was with my gelding a little bit because she is an independent lady and she doesn't need me. But I know people who like are super, we're all so busy. Like life is just absolutely bonkers for everybody. And I know some people aren't able to make it out and spend time or the amount of time with their horses than they would like. And I call it horse mom guilt.
Mhm.
But any thoughts on people who are experiencing things like that? Yeah, horse mom guilt.
Yeah, and I hear this one all the time, especially this time of year when it's dark and it's cold and it's like so hard to you get out of work at like 5 o'clock or whatever, and then it's like, oh, it's dark and freezing and I have to go out to the barn. But like even thinking about how can we reframe that thought of like we don't have to do these things, we get to do these things.
Yes.
So even like practicing small reframes like that, as well as like adjusting expectations for what different times of year and different phases of life look like for you and your horse. That can be so helpful. And as long as like your horse has, what do they say, like food, forage, friends, or what is it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Freedom.
Freedom and yeah.
Yes. So like those sorts of things, like their basic needs are being met. And so like as long as they're okay, where's that pressure coming from? And of course, it could be coming from like a variety of different spaces, like especially if you're looking to show and things like that, there might be that added pressure. But sometimes it just comes down to really breaking things into smaller parts.
Mhm.
Um, so even down to like, okay, after work, I'm gonna like start my car. I'm gonna let it warm up. I'm gonna get in, drive to the barn. Like really thinking of the smaller parts rather than, yeah, I have to go and work them for an hour or whatever that might be.
Yeah, yeah. I think it depends on like the individual horse too. Like my intention was never to go to the barn every day. My gelding had a lot of health issues. I was out multiple times a day, sometimes doing medications. So I got
Okay.
into the habit of that. And then with my new mare, she gets pissy with me if I come out every day. She's like, "Why are you here? I do not need you." And some people, they're like, oh, she'll adjust, she'll get used to it. I'm like, or I can take this as permission to not come out every day and look at all the time I've gained in my life. So
Yes.
it's been like a few people were like, oh, she'll adjust. But like for me personally, it was just such a relief to know that. And like even like I was sick for a week and I didn't make it out. And like she was fine. I knew she was fine. I'm like, this is why I pay for full board so that
Yes.
if I can't make it, I know she's fine.
Mm.
And I think it's so, I put that on myself. There has been at no point that, oh, my gelding was a little needy, but, and I would go out 3 times a day and shove eye meds in his eyes and he'd still be like, Mom, hi.
Yes.
So
Yeah, but even
adjusting your expectations and figuring out like what does your horse actually need versus what you're putting on yourself too is a very big difference sometimes.
yes, yeah, and I can definitely see like especially if there are medical related things and you have to be out there or there's nobody else there that's able to do what needs to be done. Of course that like that changes because then you have to
Yeah.
reprioritize. But burnout can definitely come from that because it's like you're giving, 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 and is it like really filling your cup as much as it used to? So and if it's not, then like finding other things, even if it's outside of horses that will like fill your cup so that way you can give back and enjoy spending that time with your horse. Um, but yeah, I think it's a big theme in the winter months of
Yeah.
like it's hard. It's hard to get out there and then it's we're tired and our body is like burning more energy because we're trying to stay cold and all those sorts of things. But I think, giving yourself grace and permission to lean into other things and whether that's like relaxing, reading, like anything that's like self-care related that doesn't involve horses, that's okay too.
Yes. Which I think is a really big one that a lot of us end up forgetting that, like, yes, they're such a big part of our life, but there is life outside of horses too. And I think that piece often gets forgotten.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I think it's so interesting because after I was always like at the barn multiple times a day. Not that my horse needed me, but I just like live so close that I'm like, oh, I'll help with turnout. I'll do night
Yes.
check. I'll do all the things. Um, but after I broke my collarbone, I was forced to like chill. I had no other option but to sit still and like rely on other people to do those sorts of things. And I couldn't ride. So I was like, after and that's kind of my positive reframe of the experience was, wow, like I am able to actually relax and take care of myself and I don't need to be go, go, go all the time. And I think that's really helped with the burnout.
Right? Forced relaxation is something fascinating. Even like I have been like ongoing like tweakiness with my hip, and like when I was off sick for a week, I'm like, oh, but my hip doesn't hurt. I'm like, oh, maybe I need to slow down a little bit then.
Yes.
It's amazing what can happen when you just rest a little bit.
Yes. And like listening to your body too. And
Yes.
like that's just like an indication of, oh, okay, well, maybe I gotta take it easy.
Yeah. Listen to the whispers before it screams at you.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I know you mentioned like your work with PTSD, and I would love to chat about that, like that world, especially with horses, and how much like I've worked with many individuals with PTSD, and they have found like healing in horses in terms of like their mirrored behavior and like just being so the horses just being so open. Any experiences with using, I don't know if you necessarily like incorporate horses with your practice, but in terms of like working with horse people?
Yeah, and that's something I'd love to. I did my Igala training many years ago, like
Yes.
probably a decade ago, and I did it and then I never used it. So something I definitely want to revisit down the road to be able to do that and offer that to people again. So right now, not currently like using horses in that sort of capacity with clients. But yeah, I think with individuals with PTSD prior to like PTSD that's not related to a horse
Yeah.
accident.
Well, different worlds there.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, but just like finding community in horses, like have it like actually finding a group of people who understand them and like feeling accepted um with horses. Like especially if that was something that they were missing before. Um, but as far as like individuals who have no trauma history and who have like suffered an accident or injury or a scary incident, anything can cause PTSD depending on the person. Um, I think that has been just so interesting with how the brain works, like especially if this is something that is your safe place, but then it's also the place where this big trauma occurred, can really I mean, there's grief in that too, because
Yeah.
you're losing that safe space, or something that was once safe after like following an accident. And it can feel super confusing, like experiencing those like PTSD symptoms if you've never experienced them before, if that makes sense.
So I have complex PTSD from medical experiences, and for me,
Okay.
it's so interesting. Like all of that was very like 30 years worth of suppressed until I started like my therapy experience, and it was
Hmm.
interesting things that like didn't used to were not a big deal at the barn. All of a sudden, I would experience like symptoms of something, and it'd be like, oh, like oh, that's a new experience where like. Or even just people talk about like your reactions like with a spook, and like I'm very good at disassociating, and everyone's like, oh, you sat that so well, because I would have no reaction. I'd be like, my brain left the building like 30
Yep, was
minutes
not there.
ago and it hasn't come back yet. So
Hmm.
for me, working through and like acknowledging that having that information, and then being able to like, okay, so my horse is spooking. I can feel that I'm like leaving the building. Do I stay present? Or like it was it really affected how I was riding, because I was then acknowledging what things were happening within my brain and body, and then trying to like piece it all together at the same time. And it was so interesting, like not horse related, but horse related. And while you're riding, it's such a like second by second experience of what's happening with your body, what's happening with the horse's body, what's happening with the snow falling off of the roof. And it was really fascinating slash exhausting
Yes.
through that initially.
Absolutely. And that's something too, like once people start really to kind of peeling back the layers of trauma and like reactions and things like that, it's like more things can come to the surface where it's like,
Yeah.
oh, I didn't realize that this was part of PTSD or like my reaction to a situation that happened many years ago or whatever that might be. And with horses, it's like there could be that sense of hypervigilance where we're picking up on every little thing, and that can be exhausting.
Yes. Yeah. And I was very fortunate. I have had very forgiving equine partners that are like, okay, lady, like, you're okay up there. But
Yes.
it's
Hmm.
for me, like, especially with their immediate reactions to like, as soon as I was back and like almost fully present, they would take a deep breath and be like, okay, she's good. And like,
Yes.
that was like, even though I couldn't necessarily feel that in my body, they gave me confirmation that I was back. And
Mhm.
that was a really cool partnership to be like, okay, let's everyone move on.
Yes. Yeah. But to have that sort of relationship with the horse is huge too, to be like, okay, we're okay. You took a deep breath, you're calm, I can be
Yes.
calm.
So then I'm good. Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think like an example of this, which I'm totally comfortable sharing, the injury that I had was because I was leading horses back into the barn, and this heavy machinery came down the road, spooked both horses. They flew forward and together and squashed me.
Oh,
Um, And so I will never be leading two horses again.
yeah.
That is not something that I will be doing, even though I did it for many years before this. But I was months after and like healed from my injury, leading one of the horses out to the field. I was and he's the best boy. I was just picking up like my hypervigilance. I was like hearing things that I probably would have never heard before, like super sensitive to all the different things going on. And he was totally fine. But by the time I got to his field, I could not, I felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't take in
Yeah.
a deep breath. I went into total like panic mode. And even as a therapist, like my mind went there, like to just like panic. And I know that was just like a symptom of like this experience that I had with this particular horse, even though he's totally fine and he was like, what's going on? Like nothing's happening right now. Um, but yeah, so even just like validating that for people that like even as a therapist who specializes in trauma, like we're human.
Yes. And we're working with like potentially very unstable, very large animals.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
there's always that potential of something to happen. And I
Hmm.
think again that comes in like the need for compassion in the horse world of like, well, why didn't you bring just both of the boys in at the same time? I'm like, because our farm right now is pure ice and they're all a little fresh because it's windy and I don't feel like dying today.
Yes, yes.
Would it have been fine? Probably, but again, I'm okay with going one at a time. And
Yes, I
even then things can happen too, but I think just having that compassion for people of going with what is comfortable for you, what do you need to feel comfortable in this situation? And
Mhm.
it's yeah, it's
Yep. And so what if it takes a little bit longer as long as like you are feeling comfortable?
I timed it the one day, so like I'll help with like dinner duty occasionally if like our farm manager is one of my best friends, but if she's away, it's me doing dinner. And there was the one day it was like pouring rain, so I tried to do it quickly. I brought two in at a time, and then the next day I just didn't feel like dealing with that, so I did one at a time. And I think it was only I only saved 4 minutes doing two at a time. And I was like, okay, so I feel pretty good because by the time we get all the halters on, everyone's organized. Like if I was like, it really genuinely doesn't save that much time for me. So
Yeah,
save walking.
yes, yeah, but I think that could be so validating too to be like,
Yeah,
okay, we're not even saving that much time, and
I'm
as
really not
we're
saving that
comfortable.
much time.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. How can addressing one's own mental health benefit their relationship with their horse? I know we've touched on it a little bit, but specifically, like in my line of work, anyways, like trying to like convince people to come and do a session with me, it works
Mhm.
9 out of 10 times if I'm like, this is how it will benefit your horse. So if we're looking to have an equestrian start to address some of their mental health concerns, how is that going to help them with their relationship with their horse?
Great question. Um, and again, like our horses are so, I mean, they're sensitive beings. And so if we come into their space and we are feeling anxious or we're feeling off, even if it's been like a bad day at work, chances are they're feeling that from you. And how is that affecting your ride? How is that affecting just your time in general with them? So being able to take care of yourself, being able to acknowledge your feelings and implement coping skills that feel genuine to you can absolutely have a positive effect on your relationship with your horse, your riding, all those sorts of things. Because like that, the anxiety and things like that, stressors, they take up so much room in our heads. And so if we're able to take care of ourselves in those sorts of ways, it's going to benefit us both in and out of the saddle.
Absolutely. And I I always go back to like I see it posted online all the time of like only one of you is allowed to freak out at a time and it's never your turn. And
Yes.
I take that into like each ride of like not
Mhm.
suppressing, but just like if I come in as a more regulated human, I'm going to be able to help my horse be a much more regulated little brain too.
Yes, yeah, and I really recommend like if people had a tough day at work or whatever is stressing them out before they get to the barn, before you step foot in that barn, do something that's like going to be like taking care of yourself. So whether that's taking a few deep breaths or I love EMDR music. So like if people have headphones and they put on EMDR, like that bilateral music, um,
Good.
it's
It's
really nice.
so good.
Yeah, so just to like calm yourself down and get yourself into the right headspace before spending time with your horse can be so helpful. And honestly, your horse doesn't deserve your anxiety. Like, they're living their life and like it's your job to take care of yourself.
I love that. Yeah, it's come in and just be the best that you can be for them.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that touches a little bit on what I wanted to chat about next. But what are some things that we can do at the barn to fuel our nervous system or to help regulate our nervous system versus tax it?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I think just like really doing a check-in to see how you're feeling. Like I said, even before you step foot into the barn, to be like, okay, what sort of mood am I in? What do I need to do for myself right now? And if you're feeling anxious or, as I said before, stressed out about something else, you got to do something to take care of yourself. And it's not a good time to like come into the barn and decide that you're gonna like I don't know, do all the things that like typically make you super stressed out. Um, but I feel like that's something that we do too because we might come in and be like, I'm gonna rearrange my whole tack trunk right now. And of course, like that can actually, could be a stress reducer, but it can also cause more stress and anxiety. So really deciding on how you're gonna make the most out of your time. Again, rather than like things being more taxing. And sometimes too, if you're not in the right headspace and you know that there are going to be people at the barn that you know are not going to be filling your cup, how are you going to navigate those situations? And so it's like perfectly fine to be like, hey, like I don't have too much time today. Like I'm just gonna hop on. We'll catch up another time, or like let's grab coffee at another time, like protecting your peace in that sort of way. And I think that could be uncomfortable for people to do, but I think that's important.
Icky.
Yes.
But they're
Hmm.
really important.
Yes. Yeah. So those sorts of things, as well as just like making sure, you're taking care of your basic needs, you're drinking water, you're eating, like, because I think, especially for those of us who can get lost in our barn time, it could be like 4 hours and we're like, wait, I didn't eat lunch. Mhm.
That summarizes my life perfectly.
It's so easy.
It's so easy. So easy. It's like my husband has now finally figured out. I'm like, I won't be too long. He's like, okay, sure.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Barn time. We just run on our own little world there.
And I don't know how we get lost in it, but like, and I think about that all the time. It's like, what happens? It's like you enter a different vortex, and then it's like, then you have to come back to reality, and it's like 5 hours later.
Yes. And you're like, oh, that was the whole day, basically.
Yes. Hmm.
Awesome. Any other final comments, words of wisdom?
Yeah, and again, I so appreciate the space to talk about these things. And I think the more we talk about these things, the better off we're going to be. Because that, like, the shame and all those sorts of negative emotions thrive in silence. So the moment that we're able to speak up on something, like the moment we're like, unveiling and normalizing and those sorts of things. So, and if you feel like the people that you're talking to about health related concerns are dismissive or not really listening or downplaying things like that, really consider if those people are really aligning with you, and are they filling your cup? Are they healthy to have in your circle? Because there are people out there that are going to be supportive and I don't know, be there to listen and validate and all those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And I think even just coming down to like finding the right therapist for you, like I think as a practitioner, I know a few people, that's a bad example. I was gonna say, a few clients like have tried someone else and like they're like, I'm so sorry, I just want to. I'm like, no, absolutely. If that's a good fit, they end up coming back. But that's
Mhm.
like I think as practitioners, we just genuinely want what's best for those people. And
Mhm.
there will be people that mesh really well with you, and it's okay if they don't. So like if someone as a client is hesitant to try something else, I think as practitioners, we don't care. We just genuinely want what's best for everybody. So it's keep keep shopping around until you're like, you're my person. Thank you.
Yes, yes, and that's something you have to do. You have to shop around, and if you're like feeling like it's hard to find somebody, I mean, I'm always happy to like provide referrals,
Yeah.
especially because I'm only licensed in 4 states here. So it's like if somebody needs help out in Nevada, like I'm not licensed there, but I can help you find
Yes.
somebody.
Yeah, exactly. I love that.
Yes,
Thank you
thank you.
so much. This was lovely. I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Good. Thank you. Thank you.